Now, sometimes recovery doesn't occur right away. You can get a tree and it may just sit there for a year looking, green, but not doing much of anything. And what it's telling you is, you know what, I'm sorry, I don't got enough to give you anything yet. I just got enough roots to keep what I've got out there. And I just can't put anything out there. But maybe in the second to third year, usually the second to third, you might start seeing something. Why fertilize? Oh, the thing Randy did with this fertilization was he, in the both the pumice as well as the mulch bed, he, after the first 10 days, he would use 20-20-20 full strength every 10 days. He said he don't know why it works. It just worked well. He's also went to time release and put it one in May and one in September. He puts it on the pumice and he also puts it around the mulch. One of the suspicions is, I'll explain cation exchange. For trees in the native environment and in even in our bonsai pots, to sometimes absorb their nutrients, the nitrogen and the potassium and the phosphorus are charged particles, and they have to attach themselves to particles in the soil, typically organic particles, for the tree then to absorb these charged particles off. If the material in the growing medium doesn't have what's called a high cation exchange, which are positive ions, meaning they don't hold a lot of those ions, then it's hard for the tree to absorb the nutrients because it doesn't have a high capacity. Whereas peat moss and decomposed pine bark and all that has a very high cation exchange, which is why they plant nursery material in it, because things grow really well in that. Well, in this case, the pumice and the mulch do not have high cation exchange ratios, and therefore that's maybe one of the reasons they can feed so heavily and strongly, especially on stuff that's been just dug up. You would probably never recommend putting 20-20 full strength onto a bonsai 10 days after you repotted it. So anyway, so that's one of the reasons he thinks it might work. He also said he would put the fertilizer on the foliage when he watered it as well. So that's what he does in terms of fertilizer. And when is enough? Remove trees from the mulch bed the following spring. And again, I wouldn't just automatically remove them. I would take one of the trees and move the mulch around and see what the roots are around it before I would just pick them all up. But there's an excellent chance that you should have a coarse root system, which is going to help the tree survive. Assuming the tree is showing healthy growth, that's what we're going to do. And then you're going to take the trees from the mulch bed, and now you're going to stick them in a nursery pot, just like we stuck the ones that had a lot of roots in a nursery pot that we just talked about. So they'll go from the mulch bed into a training pot of pumice, with the goal of getting them used to the culture and getting more healthy roots, so that we can then think about reducing those roots to get them into a bonsai pot, or we can leave them in there to develop if we feel the tree needs more development. The last section, sort of some things that I call it falling leaves, the leftovers here. One of the things that people are tempted to do is when they get a root ball, taking the pumice as well, stick some holes in there to let some air in there. Don't do that. That's just wrecking whatever roots might be there, and it's not helping. If you have it in a mulch bed, or you have your trees on the ground in pots, if you don't want to move them because of mulch, you're gonna if you thought they would be really affected, shade cloth would be used. That way you don't have to move the tree. Misting is good with mulch beds. The one downside is most people don't have a good misting system that just mists it regularly and only mists the top, because most mist systems are on too long and then they start soaking the soil, which then gets rid of the oxygen, and then all the benefits that we thought we were getting from the mulch are lost. So you don't have to use it. He doesn't have a mist system. He said he'd use it if he had it, but he doesn't, and his trees do well. Keep collected trees close together to increase humidity. Also placing, if you don't have a lot of trees, putting them near your own shrubs or things like that might also improve their ability to get humidity when they're on the ground. Let's see, if you collect a deciduous tree, again, those are trees that drop their leaves, like maples, elms, etc. Once you put it either in the mulch and or your pot, put them in full sun right from the get-go, because they are not like conifers or whatever that are all already transpiring. They haven't created their solar panels yet. And again, when the trees are growing, let the trees grow untrimmed. And because the top is the solar panels that contributes to the bottom. So the more you let the top grow, the more you get root growth. A lot of people might be feel like, wow, I'm going to start styling and I want to trim it. It's going to get out of shape. Don't do that, because you're merely interfering with the solar panels providing the growth for the roots. So the solar panels provide for the roots provide for the solar panels. So let it go. Leave conifers grow untrimmed in the mulch or pots. Some root growth occurs in the spring, as I mentioned, but most root growth will occur in early to late fall, and let the tree grow to set it up for next spring. Okay, remove trees from the mulch beds the following springs as the buds swell, which we just talked about, right? Bud swelling is the time when you do root work on trees. And again, you're only going to remove them if you thought that they've added growth. If they just sustain themselves and barely put out a wee little bit of, maybe a candle, a small candle or small growth, leave them in there, give them one more year to recover. And again, remove them carefully. When you're removing them, you're going to put them into pumice with 1/16 remaining in the pumice. Again, the reason you're leaving smaller particle sizes is you're allowing a little less oxygen and a little more moisture to stay in the pot. Again, some people say, what about I want to dig this tree in the middle of the summer? If you have no choice but to dig it, or if somebody's going to come and do some construction, they're going to dig it, and you want to take your chances on the deciduous tree, go for it. But if you're going to do that, that would be a time where you would reduce the foliage mass. When you cut the tree, you would reduce the foliage mass so that it wouldn't have to transpire as much. And it's not because it's not going to have the roots to be able to sustain that foliage. And actually, that's what they would. I remember them when we would dig trees, they would say, probably 30, 40 years ago, so that was the thing that they recommend doing all the time. But that really only applies to summer. Heat mats are something you could think about in the spring if you wanted to assist your root growth, but you want to be careful with heating mats because they will get your roots to grow, but a lot of people forget to pay attention and the tree dries out because the roots are growing and they didn't see the top growing very much and didn't realize the tree was using water. Boxes, if you're going to make a box, don't put feet on the box because it's keeping it off the ground. Don't put handles on the box because they can make it easier to pick up because they'll break and you'll drop the tree, which lacks them. We don't have stability. And the more holes you put in the bottom of the box, the better because more air gets in. And how long is too long? You want to get your trees out of a collection container or collection bed, mulch bed, if it's showing signs of healthy growth after the first year. If it's in a pot for 3 years, or let's say it's healthy and you leave it in for 3 years, it's going to start going downhill. You want to get it out of that pot. Even if you haven't made your mind up what you want to do, get it out of the pot, work the roots, put it back into a smaller pot or whatever, but don't leave it in beyond 3 years. Or after the third year. It's usually not good for trees to stay in collection pot after 3 years. So 3 years should be max. Lessons learned from the aftercare of field-grown deciduous trees. One of the things that came out is if your tree's really struggling, your bonsai tree, a lot of people think about slip potting, which means you take it out of the pot, try to not mess with the roots and stick it in something bigger. That's probably really not a very good strategy because you can't integrate the roots into what you're sticking it into. But taking that tree and putting it into mulch would probably be a really good thing that could help the tree. So if you're not really sure what to do and it's not doing well, consider doing that because you're going to get more air into the root system. So that would be something to learn what to do with your bonsai from the aftercare of field-grown trees. And then I have lessons learned in quotations from collecting field-grown deciduous trees. I started bonsai probably in 1981. A friend of mine, I was a graduate student at Baylor, and a friend of mine from Connecticut brought his trees down to Waco, Texas, and he asked me to water them, and I got really fascinated by the trees. And when I went back to the Pittsburgh area where I grew up, I told him I would go to this field that I used to play in when I was little. I said, they have lots of wild crabapple trees. So I dug up a couple crabapple trees and took them back to Texas, and I kept some for myself. Didn't know what I was doing, but I mangled those roots and I was harsh, and those things survived. So deciduous trees can be severely top pruned and root pruned at the same time. And there's a saying, kill it or make it a bonsai. And that's what they're talking about. At that time, if you're gonna go after that tree, don't think I should go in there and half cut the roots and know I'll go back and do them more, because you won't. And we'll explain why. If you're gonna do it, dig it and go for what you're going to need, because you're not going to be able to do that. But I didn't know that. So I killed, God, the amount of trees I killed over the years, because I learned how to do bonsai by digging up a field tree and realizing, wow, you can just whack the hell out of these things. And then they grow in a pot for a little while, and I do the same thing a couple of years later. And sometimes they made it, sometimes they didn't. But that's what I thought would apply to bonsai. But it only applies once. Never treat trees like that again. The bonsai pot changes everything. So you can do that to a tree one time and you'll never do it again. And if you do, you'll learn why, because it'll die on you. So how are pre-bonsai and bonsai repotting and aftercare different from handling collected material? Trees in nature accumulate massive amounts of energy to grow bigger every year. So when a tree's done growing, it set itself up with all of this tremendous amount of energy to maybe 2 or 3 foot taller than it once was, and wider and bigger. So there's massive amounts of energy in that tree. So when you dig it, it has a ton in reserves to take care of things. Also, many trees have tap roots. Junipers, for instance, have tap roots and what are called spring roots. And one thing used to be, well, they'd say junipers don't need a lot of water. They grow naturally in dry areas. However, they also have a tap root that goes down way down deep. So when the spring rains stop, they can rely on that to live. When you put a juniper in a bonsai pot, it doesn't have tap roots and it survives completely on spring roots because it's constantly moist. So we've actually changed the environment for those junipers. So we are severely changing trees when we put them into a bonsai container. The water column in the table, or the water column in the pot, is incredibly shallow compared to what's going in nature. And so water doesn't drain out as quickly. Once we put a tree in a pot, they're prone to accidents. Sometimes we water them too much. Sometimes we don't water them enough. The roots in trees that are growing in nature aren't subjected to sudden extreme temperature changes, heat or cold, because they have ground which buffers them. Trees in nature have beneficial relationships with worms and critters aerating the soil and fertilizing them. There's fungus and bacteria, and there's flora that have symbiotic relationships which help each other grow. There's more organic matter, and there's renewal of organic matter in trees in nature. The trees are more stable. Yes, they can blow over, but we can't pick them up and move them around. They're not knocked off benches. The soil that they're growing in doesn't deteriorate. It doesn't lose percolation. And for the most part, they're not subjected to repeated removal of branches and foliage. So when you put your tree into a pot, what everybody will tell you in the nursery industry, or what they'll tell you that you can do, don't believe them. These trees are incredibly much more sensitive than they once were. So what's the difference? Wait, where are we? Bones are okay. So what's the difference between growing and aftercare for field-grown trees versus repotting trees? Join us Tuesday, February 15th at 7 p.m. We'll be doing repotting at our meeting, and we'll also be doing a thread grafting. And now I'm going to try to close this out and open it up for questions.
So, Mike, if you don't mind, I'll go back through the questions we have in the chat and just read them out myself instead of asking the original person to ask the question again.
Thanks.
And then when we're done, it's up to you if you want to open it up to everybody to just speak up and ask their question, or we can continue having them put their question in the chat and I'll read them out, which might help us move along more quickly in a more orderly fashion.
Well, I'll go with put them in the chat.
Okay, so as we go through our discussion, if anybody has follow-on questions or thinks of something else, please put it in the chat and we'll get to them in the order in which you put them in there. Okay, so the first one was actually from me, and I asked if you could go into detail on why doing things around the time of bud swell is the best time to collect a tree.
Horticulturally, I can't tell you why. Experientially, they just know trees survive better when that happens. They're just, for whatever reason, they respond to root pruning. They compartmentalize it better, they heal better, and they live better. I don't know. I don't know if I could give you the horticultural reasons why.
Okay, fair enough. Next one was.
I might be able to speak to that if you'd like me to.
Oh. Mike?
That wasn't me.
I know, but is it all right? You want Terry to go
Yeah,
ahead?
yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Terry.
So when for collecting trees, remember what you're about to do to them. You're going to cut off all those roots. What is bud swelling? Well, bud swell is when the tree sends energy from the roots to the buds to set them up to make green. So once the buds have swelled, it has the energy now to make a leaf. If you collect before bud swell, that process hasn't happened. And it will be often that you'll collect a deciduous tree, for example, and you'll get no roots at all. And that'll, your chance of success is going to be very small if you don't have any swollen buds on the tree. And so we want that energy to have transferred from the root mass into the soon to be foliage. Now we can get away with being early on our bonsai with a little bit of repotting, because if we're doing our job right, already have a pot full of fine roots. We're not going to cut all those roots off. And so we're just sort of trimming the roots and putting it back into the same container usually. And so we can repot earlier and sometimes even much later, because we're not really messing with the roots severely on an established bonsai. But for collected material, we need that energy from the roots to be in the buds before we cut the roots completely off. There's your answer.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question was Louise, who had a question about what cutting tools you would use if you were out in the woods. You had mentioned using an electric cutter with a long cord.
Reciprocating saw.
Yeah. So, do you have suggestions on what you would use if you went out in the woods to do that?
Wow. Well, first of all, carrying it all. But one, you need, obviously, depending on what you're going to do, you loppers are good. An axe is what we talked about, and a very good, strong square edge shovel. The other thing you might want to have is a top saw for what you're going to, if you're going to get deciduous tree, you're going to have to, you saw the tree I think Josh brought in. I think he must have taken, I don't know, 6-7 feet off of that. So you need a good tree saw as well, probably good pruners as well. So you're taking in a decent amount of tools. You're going to take in burlap, you're going to take in twine, something to carry it out, or don't, something, you're going to dig something that you can carry out. And the one thing again, most of our eyes are bigger than our stomach. Sometimes we end up digging out a root ball and don't appreciate that that's a 200-pound root ball.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, next question. Hunter McDonald asked, as far as pruning off branches, is that pre or post digging up? And I don't remember what part of the presentation we're at when he asked that.
You could do it at the time. In other words, if you're going to take a deciduous tree, you could saw it, you could prune the top and dig the bottom. You could do that at the same time. As we talked about with conifers, the pine, spruces, you want to leave as much needle mass on that as possible to regenerate the roots, where deciduous trees are a little different. And then I also talked that if you really had the time, going out at bud swell or early spring and cutting them. Now, another potential time you could cut them probably in June, July at post flush hardening, when the leaves have hardened off. You could go in and cut again and then dig in the spring. But the best scenario would be to cut it in the spring. But if you're going to dig them in deciduous and dig it and cut it, you can do it at the same time.
Okay, SK asked what about putting sphagnum moss around the root ball? You were talking about putting it in mulch and, versus putting other things around the root ball.
I don't know. I just have never used it. And I just know that mulch works really well. She could experiment with it and try it.
Okay. Then I asked about pumice versus mulch, which you answered in the presentation, but Hunter also commented that he's always heard pumice is the way to go with Yamadori. So I guess it's worth asking if you have anything more that you would contribute to that topic.
The reason he has heard that, most Yamadori are collected in the mountains and they're in rock pockets. So when you collect Yamadori in the mountains, you don't go with a shovel, you go with pry bars. And basically the trees growing that they get out of the mountains, or if you will, they're growing in a pot, technically, that is rocks. And if you go up to a tree and you wiggle it and it's sitting in rocks, it's like, oh, that's a potential Yamadori. And so they'll go and they'll bust the rocks. And oftentimes they'll get a substantial root system, almost sometimes the entire root system. So then you could stick that into pumice. So that's probably the big difference. When you're getting stuff out of rock pockets versus you're going into the field, you're talking about two different animals.
Good. Dave, or David's iPad, asked if you talk about stabilizing the trees in the mulch bed with rebar or fence, etc. You did mention rebar, but perhaps there's more techniques that are.
You know what? There could be. There's any number of techniques, as long as it works and keeps the tree from wiggling. That would be, yeah. Whatever you could use would work. A fence could work as well. Sure.
Louise commented on worms. Maybe she was just joking about it, but you mentioned how getting worms in the pot is a good thing when they're sitting on the ground. And she mentioned the Asian jumping earthworm, which I'm not even sure if it's a real thing. It might not be one that you want in your pot.
The only thing I've heard about the Asian worms, the problem with them is not that they'd be a problem in the pot. I've heard they're so voracious that they can denude a hillside of leaves, which is holding the rain from getting on it and exposing it. And when the rain hits it, there's no leaves to protect it and they wash out. I heard the problem. I don't know much beyond that.
Okay.
And I don't know what you're going to do if they're in there. You can get them out, but if they're in your ground, I don't know what you're going to do.
So Paul asked if there are species that are illegal to harvest.
If there are what?
Are there species that are illegal to harvest?
Yeah, any species on somebody's property. No, I don't.
Laurels, right? Mountain laurels.
Yeah, it's anyway. But people sometimes you hear the stories. I don't know of any species, and we can ask around. I've never heard there's a species that I would know of that's illegal to harvest.
I thought mountain laurels. I heard that. I don't know.
Well, well, again, I guess if somebody's private property and they let you on and you can dig it up, I guess if you went on to state property, whatever property, you better get the owner or the state's permission to be on it.
Yeah, which leads well into our next question from JGSD VMOSU, I don't know who that is, who asked if there's a permit required to collect from state lands.
I think there would be. I would definitely contact the authorities. I would not be out there digging stuff up, hoping this is okay.
Let's see. Then I asked a question which you already answered. David Zermowski asks, if building a box, should we avoid using pressure treated wood?
I would, yeah, because there's the advantage, I guess it would last longer. The other thing, I don't know all the different chemicals in it. I would suspect they're probably not good, but I don't know.
Okay, that's it. There are a few compliments along the way, which I echo, I think, on behalf of everybody. And I think that's all the questions we have.